How one photo exposed America's worst asylum. On the outskirts of Philadelphia, there once stood a sprawling campus of over 50 buildings. With its green fields and stately architecture, it could have been mistaken for a university or a quiet country retreat. This was the Philadelphia State Hospital, but it became known to the world by a much more infamous name: Byberry. It began with a noble idea, born from a nationwide reform movement to treat the mentally ill with humanity. The goal was to create a sanctuary, a place of healing far from the chaos of the city. But behind the locked doors and manicured lawns, a nightmare was unfolding. A reality of filth, neglect, and shocking cruelty. For decades, the city and state allowed a house of horrors to operate in plain sight, hidden from the public. Until one man, with one camera, took a series of photos that would change everything. This is the story of how a brave journalistic expose blew the lid off a national scandal and helped bring a corrupt system to its knees. To understand the tragedy of Byberry, you have to understand the dream it was built on. At the turn of the 20th century, the mentally ill were often treated like criminals, warehoused in prisons or the squalid basements of city almshouses. In Philadelphia, many were kept at a notorious institution called Blockley, a place of immense suffering. Inspired by reformers like Dorothea Dix, a movement grew to create something better. The idea was simple but revolutionary, that mental illness was a disease, not a moral failing, and that people deserved to be treated with dignity and care. The city purchased a large farm, and around 1906, construction began. Byberry was born, first as a small work farm and officially established in 1907. It was designed as a cottage plan asylum, a self-sufficient colony where patients could work the land, breathe fresh air, and receive therapeutic care. When it opened, it was seen as a progressive leap forward. Mayor John E. Rayburn championed the project, testifying that it would give the city's most vulnerable residents a chance to be treated as patients, not punished as criminals. The first patients were transferred from the brutal, overflowing wards at Blockley in 1911. For a brief moment, Byberry represented hope. It was meant to be a flagship institution, an example for the rest of the country. But that dream wouldn't just fade, it would be consumed by a crisis that turned hope into horror. The slide from paradise to pandemonium was shockingly fast. The problem was a disaster created by three brutal facts: too many people, not enough money, and a government that looked the other way. Philadelphia's population was exploding, and Byberry was immediately overwhelmed. Designed for a fraction of the number it would hold, the population swelled uncontrollably. By 1914, it was already crowded with over 2,200 residents, making it one of the largest institutions of its kind in Pennsylvania. At its peak in the 1960s, that number would climb to an almost unbelievable 7,000 patients. The hospital was bursting at the seams. People were forced to sleep in hallways, crammed together with no space, privacy, or dignity. Funding from the city, and later the state, was criminally low. Legislative penny pinching meant the hospital couldn't hire enough staff, afford basic supplies, or even maintain its own buildings. The result was an environment of absolute squalor. Investigations over the years revealed the same horrifying conditions: raw sewage lining the corridors, floors sticky with urine, and bedding that went unwashed. Patients were often left unbathed, unclothed, and covered in their own filth. Staffing levels were beyond appalling. Some reports from the time claimed there could be a single attendant responsible for entire wards of hundreds of patients. The staff who were hired were underpaid, undertrained, and utterly overwhelmed. They were tasked with controlling hundreds of patients in an environment that bred contempt and despair. As one governor later admitted, the cows in state hospital barns received better care than the men and women in the wards. This wasn't a hospital anymore. It was a warehouse for human beings, and the conditions inside were about to foster a culture of unimaginable cruelty. Where neglect festers, abuse is sure to follow. At Byberry, the lack of resources and oversight created a playground for sadism. Overworked and often unqualified attendants resorted to violence as a primary means of control. Beatings were routine. According to some accounts, a code of silence among employees meant that most abuse went unreported, and those who dared to speak up were ostracized. The violence was endemic. One particularly horrifying story, reported in multiple secondary sources, tells of a 1919 incident where two orderlies were arrested for killing a patient. They allegedly confessed to choking him with extreme force. In a stunning failure of justice, they reportedly claimed their actions were due to PTSD from World War I and were eventually rehired at higher pay. According to reports from the time, patients were subjected to torturous practices disguised as treatment. Some accounts describe a so-called water cure that involved twisting a wet towel around a patient's neck to inflict pain without leaving marks. Restraints were often used not for safety, but for punishment and convenience. Patients were reportedly locked for long stretches in thick leather handcuffs and canvas camisoles. Medical care was virtually non-existent. There were allegations from staff interviews that teeth were pulled without Novocaine. To compensate for the lack of staff, patients were often heavily drugged into a stupor just to keep them quiet. Worse, Byberry, like many institutions of its day, became a site for human experimentation. Powerful new antipsychotic drugs were tested on patients, often without any semblance of informed consent. Dozens of deaths over the years were officially attributed to neglect, from starvation to untreated illnesses, though the true number is certainly much higher. The hospital was not a place of healing. It was a place where people were sent to be forgotten, to suffer, and to die. For decades, the horrors of Byberry remained a poorly kept secret, known to officials but hidden from the public. That all changed because of a group of men who chose service over war. During World War II, many conscientious objectors, men whose pacifist beliefs prevented them from joining the military, were assigned to work in understaffed mental hospitals. What they witnessed shocked them to their core. One of these men was Charlie Lord, a Quaker with a passion for photography who was assigned as an orderly at Byberry. He was appalled by the conditions. He saw men huddled together, naked and shivering in unheated wards. He saw the filth, the despair, and the evidence of routine brutality. He knew he had to show the world. Defying strict hospital rules, Lord secretly took dozens of black and white photos, capturing the hellish reality inside Byberry. These men did more than just take pictures. They organized. They founded a group called the National Mental Health Foundation and compiled reports on the appalling conditions they were witnessing in asylums nationwide. The secret photos and reports eventually made their way to a journalist named Albert Q. Maisel. On May 6, 1946, Maisel published a bombshell expose in Life magazine, one of the most widely read publications in the country. The article was titled Bedlam 1946. To a nation still grappling with the recently revealed images of Nazi concentration camps, Lord's photographs were profoundly shocking. The photos showed emaciated patients with vacant eyes, men herded together like cattle, and women left to sit naked on cold floors. The impact was explosive. there was a national uproar. The comparison to Nazi atrocities was made explicitly. 2 years later, another journalist, Albert Deutsch, walked through Byberry's wards for his book, The Shame of the States. He wrote, "As I passed through some of Byberry's wards, I was reminded of the pictures of the Nazi concentration camps. I entered a building swarming with naked humans herded like cattle and treated with less concern. The secret was out. America had seen the photos. Congress held hearings and reforms were promised. It seemed impossible that an institution so thoroughly exposed could be allowed to continue. The Bedlam 1946 expose should have been the end of Byberry. It should have been shut down immediately. But it wasn't. In a stunning example of political inertia, the Philadelphia State Hospital remained open for another 44 years. How could America see those photos and still allow this to happen? The answer lies in a tangle of political failure, public apathy, and a system with no real alternatives. The state of Pennsylvania had already taken control of Byberry from the city back in 1936, after an earlier investigation into negligence. But the change in management did little to fix the core problems. State control just meant that the responsibility was now spread across a larger bureaucracy, making it easier for officials to pass the buck. After the Life magazine article, there was a flurry of activity. Politicians expressed outrage and promised action. But as the shock wore off, the political will to enact meaningful and expensive change faded. The problem was just too big. Closing Byberry would mean finding a place for thousands of patients. It would require building a new system of community-based care from scratch, a task no one was truly prepared to fund. So instead of fundamental reform, the state opted for cosmetic changes. New buildings were constructed, and some recreational facilities were even added. But these superficial improvements did nothing to address the toxic culture of neglect. The staff-to-patient ratios remained dangerously low, and the cycle of violence continued, just with a slightly more modern facade. The expose had pulled back the curtain, but the political and social machinery required to dismantle the stage simply wasn't there. Byberry became a zombie institution, publicly condemned, yet allowed to shamble on, consuming lives for 4 more decades because the alternative was seen as too difficult and too expensive. The decades after Bedlam 1946 were a slow, agonizing burn. The hospital's population began a gradual decline, especially after the push for deinstitutionalization in the 1960s. But the fundamental problems remained. The reports of abuse never stopped. Dozens of patient deaths in the 1950s and 60s were officially attributed to neglect. People starved. They died from treatable infections. They wandered off and were found dead months later. The institution had also become a dumping ground, not just for the mentally ill, but for criminals sent for psychiatric testing instead of prison, creating an even more dangerous environment. This led to an increase in patient-on-patient violence. The event that signaled the final, complete breakdown came in 1987. A patient named Charles Gable murdered a female patient. He didn't just kill her. According to journalistic accounts, he dismembered her body and scattered the parts across the campus. In a chilling testament to the lack of supervision, the murder was reportedly discovered only when staff noticed other patients carrying her teeth, having found them on the grounds like stones. It was an act of such profound horror that it could no longer be ignored. The sickness of Byberry had finally metastasized into a monster that was consuming its own. The 1987 murder was the catalyst for Byberry's final chapter. Following the killing and decades of persistent advocacy, Pennsylvania Governor Robert P. Casey launched a full-scale investigation. A special state task force confirmed everything whistleblowers had been saying for 40 years. The report described the conditions as atrocious and irreversible. It confirmed a deep-rooted pattern of neglect, abuse, and a complete absence of meaningful treatment. Faced with this damning verdict, Governor Casey made the decision that was 4 decades overdue. In late 1987, he announced that the Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry would be permanently closed. Casey called the hospital little more than a warehouse, and 5 of its top officials were fired. The closure wasn't simple. The plan was to phase out the hospital over several years, carefully transitioning its remaining 500 or so patients into new community-based programs. The hospital's huge budget was to be redirected to fund this new system, but the transition was rocky. In 1989, after 3 recently discharged patients died by suicide, the governor was forced to temporarily halt the closure. It was a painful reminder that simply closing the doors wasn't enough. A robust support system had to be built in its place. Despite the setbacks, the course was set. The fight was finally over. The story of Byberry is a powerful reminder of how easily systems can fail when good people look away. It took the courage of individuals to expose the truth and decades of struggle to finally bring about change. If you believe these forgotten histories need to be told, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this video. What are your thoughts on how we care for the most vulnerable in our society today? Let us know in the comments below. The last 2 patients walked out of Byberry on June 21, 1990. After more than 80 years of operation, its doors were closed forever. But the story doesn't end there. The massive 50-building campus was simply abandoned. For 16 years, it was left to rot. The decaying hospital became a magnet for urban explorers and graffiti artists, drawn by its haunted reputation. The site became a modern ruin, a physical symbol of the decay that had defined its existence. The buildings were repeatedly vandalized and set on fire. The Byberry problem, as locals called it, continued long after the last patient left. Demolition was delayed when vast amounts of asbestos were discovered inside the crumbling walls. The cost of safe removal was enormous, another testament to decades of neglect. Finally, in June of 2006, the bulldozers moved in. The buildings that had housed so much misery were torn down. Today, a residential community for senior citizens called the Arbors at Eagle Point stands where Byberry once did. There is little physical evidence left of the asylum itself. Byberry is gone, but its legacy is a permanent scar on the history of mental health care in America. It stands as a chilling symbol of institutional failure, a case study in how noble intentions can collapse under the weight of overcrowding, underfunding, and societal indifference. It is a story of political cover-ups and the human cost of treating people as less than human. But it is also a story of courage. It's the story of conscientious objectors like Charlie Lord, who risked their safety to expose the truth. It's the story of advocates and journalists who refused to let the world forget. And the closure of Byberry was a pioneering moment, as Philadelphia became the first major U.S. city to shut down its state hospital and fully commit to relocating residents to community-based services instead of other institutions. The fight for humane, effective, and accessible mental health care continues, but the ghosts of Byberry serve as a permanent, harrowing reminder of why that fight is so critical. We must never forget what happened behind those walls, lest we be doomed to repeat it.